A teraz, ako dobre viete, bude priestor na diskusiu. Predtým, než si premyslíte otázku alebo svoj námet, by som rád pripomenul pravidlá diskusie, takže kto má záujem, môže sa prihlásiť. A potom podľa môjho pokynu poputuje mikrofón v ruke asistenta k nemu a môžete sa predstaviť, to je dobrovoľné, ale poprosil by som vás, aby ste povedali, či sa spýtate v angličtine alebo v slovenčine, aby sme sa mohli pripraviť a potom každý máte priestor maximálne 2 minúty na svoju konkrétnu otázku alebo námet. Takže nech sa páči, využite vzácnu možnosť nášho hostia a kto má záujem, môže sa spýtať niečo alebo povedať svoj námet. Vidím prvú ruku v 4. rade vľavo.
Môžeme anglicky aj slovensky.
Ako?
Mr. Niemietz, you've been crying, in my opinion, on the bed grave. No, you don't understand. It's an English pronunciation. It's an English saying. Crying over a bed grave means that you've been dedicating your presentation from based on, in my opinion, bad predisposition. We're talking about Soviet socialism, and the ideas of Marx was based on absolutely other basement. Marx was saying that if the power of economy will so high that capitalism and imperialism will be on the top of their existence, it has to come socialism and communism. And it has to be in the most developed country and not in the less developed country as it was done in Soviet Union at that time. That is a basic condition which was necessary to stress. That was a fault, in my opinion. You've been talking about examples in socialism, which is absolutely from negative point of view. Well, and the question, how did you not present us some examples which are nowadays in Scandinavia and in Switzerland? Minimum in communism. Basic things from communism, Marxistic communism. So everyone get what's necessary for him to survive. Maybe it was not very well explained in English. Okay, please try to explain us why not the other side of socialism.
Okay, answer, opponent.
Yeah, sure. Well, it is true. Marx did say that. He said the socialist revolution has to happen first where capitalism is most developed. But I don't buy the argument that invalidates everything that actually happened in socialist societies. Because what Marx meant by fully developed was not what we mean by it today. I mean, he was writing the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s. Developed to him meant a society where you have steam engines and railroads. By Marx's standards, a lot of the socialist societies that existed were developed. They were, if Marx had come back to life in the early 20th century, if he had been able to look at a place like this, Czechoslovakia as it was then, there is no way he would have said, oh no, this is underdeveloped, they have to invent the internet first. To him, those societies would have seemed advanced. And the second reason why I don't accept that reasoning is that actually it is possible to industrialize under socialism. It's not that they couldn't make that first step from an underdeveloped society to the early stages of industrialization. That they actually did manage to do. The Soviet Union did have a period of industrialization in the 30s. That was possible. That was And even in Eastern Europe, it wasn't clear right from the start after the Second World War that Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe would lag behind Western Europe. The basics building up, going from a very low level of development to a medium level, that is something that you can actually do under socialism. That wasn't their problem. It's just what happened was that once you had the basic industries in place, they didn't develop much further from that. They never managed to build up the consumer goods industries that Western societies developed. In that sense, they fell behind. But that's why I simply don't buy the Marxist argument that you can only start if you have the highest level of development already. Because if it had been the case that socialist economies just cannot develop at all, then you could make a case, okay, maybe it's just started too early, maybe if they had started at a higher level of industry, maybe then it would have worked. But that wasn't the problem. They did manage to industrialize. It's just that they had this short-lived growth spurt, and then they started to stagnate. And therefore, it's more the other way around. That in the very early stages, that's when socialism can be okay. But then it plateaus, and then from there on, that's where the market economies are so superior. And on the point that what Marx had in mind, well, I mean, Marx was writing the Communist Manifesto in the 1840s, Das Kapital, the 1860s. You cannot reduce an idea to just the original intentions of somebody who wrote about this 170 years ago. You wouldn't, if you raised a criticism of capitalism and I told you, oh no, read Adam Smith. Adam Smith doesn't advocate that. You wouldn't accept that, and you would be right. You would say, forget your century-old books, look at what's actually happening, how it actually turns out. And if capitalism doesn't turn out the way that Adam Smith wanted, then that's Adam Smith's problem, and you wouldn't accept that as an excuse. And in the same way, I don't accept reducing Marxism to just the original ideas and not paying any attention to anything else that happened. Now about Scandinavia or even Switzerland, well, yeah, those are capitalist economies. They have some elements of redistribution. I'm okay with that up to a point. Switzerland is perhaps a particularly good example, but that's one of the freest economies in the world. So if Switzerland is socialist, then I'm a socialist.
Thank you. Nech sa páči v prvom rade za okne.
Nebolo mi zodpovedané, takže som nejak...
Well, thank you. My name is Shimon. I'm from the magazine Týždeň. I have the one anecdote which I'm reacting to the gentleman who was speaking before. The anecdote sounds, you are not a real communist if you have not starved to death. That's the first point. And the second point is Professor White would think that it is cool to be communist, it is cool to be socialist. It's not cool to be fascist. The communists and the communist regimes all around the world has killed, assassinated and suffered plenty of more people than a fascism did. So why is it favorable and fashionable to be a socialist or a communist, especially in the US maybe? Thank you.
Yeah, that would be because in the case of fascism and Nazism in particular, it's just much easier to see the connection between the theory and the outcomes. There is, once you know the history of fascism and in particular of Nazism, and you interpret early statements of future Nazi leaders in that light, it's just absolutely clear this is such an atrocious worldview that it cannot lead to anything other than mass slaughter. So you could, with the best will in the world, you could not argue that they had anything that you could describe as noble intentions that somehow got corrupted. It was clear that they had the worst intentions right from the start, and therefore nobody could make the case that there is somehow this distinction between noble ideas, noble intentions and terrible outcomes. Whereas in the case of socialism, there is just this massive gap between the writings of early socialists and what then actually happened. And as always, when somebody makes great promises and then under-delivers, there are two possibilities. It could be that person was, those promises were unrealistic, it can't be done, or it could be that that person wasn't really trying. That's always the case with political promises. We saw that when our government said we will leave the EU by 2019. You had some people saying, okay, they betrayed us, we didn't leave the EU, you were sabotaging the will of the people, and others saying, no, I actually believe them, they were doing their best, it was just trickier than they thought. And so it is, in this case, if you have some sympathy for socialist ideas and you see this massive gap between the early rhetoric, what it was supposed to be like, the worker-run democracy, and then you see the actual outcomes, dictatorship, gulags, mass executions, it's just easy to make the assumption that they were never honest in the first place about those intentions. It's just easy to assume that they maybe said that, they talked about a nice worker-run democracy, but that they never meant it. Whereas I don't think this is correct, because I think we talked about this earlier today. I mean, I read a book by Lenin that he wrote a few months before he came to power, 1917. He describes the future socialist society. This is something of a blueprint. And what's amazing about that book, The State and Revolution, is that it is what he describes is nothing like what the Soviet Union was like. It's not true that he started with the intention of building that type of society. He really did think that once you remove the capitalist class, the workers will take over, the economy will run itself, you won't need repression. He talks about repressing counter-revolutionaries, but it sounds very much like a minor feature, something that you do in the first few months, maybe on a small scale, but then you will barely need a police, you will not really need a prison system anymore. In his writing, Lenin sounds almost like a libertarian. He talks about how the state would be unnecessary, or saying it would still exist in a sense during a transitional period. But even then, even during the transition period, it won't have to do much. Now you could say, yeah, well, talk is cheap. He wrote that, maybe he didn't mean that, maybe he was disguising his intentions. But then, the trouble with that is, a lot of people like Lenin, a lot of the future socialist leaders joined that cause when it was not a promising cause. So if Lenin had just been a power-hungry opportunist, I don't think he would have become a socialist. Because in the early 20th century, when Lenin joined, or even late 19th century, I don't remember, but at the time that he joined what would later become the Bolshevik Party, that was a fringe group. He couldn't have known that that would bring him to power. And Stalin, even more so, he spent most of his early life in prisons, in exile, in hiding from the Tsarist police. He joined the socialist cause when that was a marginalized fringe group, and if it hadn't been for a series of unforeseeable events, he would never have seen the inside of the Kremlin. If it hadn't been for the First World War, something that he couldn't have foreseen, if it hadn't been for the February Revolution, something that he couldn't have foreseen, he would have died in exile somewhere. We would never have heard the name Stalin. So these are all people who joined socialism when it was a cause for idealists. That's why I don't buy the idea that these people were all just dishonest. I'm not saying Stalin was a nice guy, he obviously wasn't, but I'm also saying he wasn't just opportunistically joining this cause, and this is true around the world. I don't know specifically about the case of Czechoslovakia, but certainly the future, the people who would end up leading East Germany. Erich Honecker, who would then be the General Secretary of the Socialist Party, he spent a decade of his life in a Nazi prison. He was initially an anti-fascist resistance fighter. So he was someone who really believed in his ideals. This wasn't someone who said, I'll join socialism because I've got better career opportunities in that way. These were all people who joined that cause when it seemed like they weren't going anywhere. So it's just too easy to say, they had the wrong intentions right from the start. I think some of them actually did have the right intentions, and that's why socialism gets a better reputation. That you can at least say the intentions were good in the beginning.
Teraz pravou stranu vyskúšame, čiže v treťom rade, tam, v modrom svety. V štvrtom rade.
As a historian, student historian, specialized on socialism, especially in Soviet Russia, I read some books by history professor Martin Malia from Berkeley, and his book Soviet Tragedy: The History of Socialism in Soviet Russia. In his last chapter, he described how hereditary of socialism. He described how socialism would like in the future. And he described that it will not be work class anymore. It will be like sexual minorities, racial minorities, also ecology. It will be some part of universal class, and it will be complete. Slowly, will limit freedom, economical freedom of people, and then slowly personal freedom. Do you agree with his statement and his legacy? And also the second question, that if you agree with Professor Anthony Sutton from Hoover Institution, who made research about Soviet economy and why so many American companies or Western companies was involved to the Soviet economy. For example, every single automobile plant was built by American or Western companies in Soviet Russia. For example, before Bolshevik Revolution, Tsarist economy had two prototypes of automobile, but now in Soviet Russia, everything completed by the West or from USA. And also, you agree with this statement? And that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, about the first one, yeah, I don't really know enough about that hypothesis. I can't comment on that. I would have to read it. The second one, yes, there was Western involvement in the industrialization process in the Soviet Union, and how big that was, I don't know whether that was the driving factor or not. But that is more or less what you would expect in the early stages of industrialization. That's how technology transfer works. You have people coming in from more advanced economies, bringing in know-how. That would have happened in a market economy as well. If the Russian Revolution had never happened, if it had industrialized in a more market-based setting, I guess it would have been through foreign direct investment. It would have been, rather than government contracts, you would have had those Westerners directly setting up their companies. So this is what you would expect at that stage of development, that you more or less just copy something that already exists in a more technologically advanced society. That's one way in which technology transfer and know-how transfer works. That is what you would expect. And that's one reason why you can, once you open up your economy, you can sometimes industrialize very rapidly because you are catching up with something that already exists elsewhere. That's why maybe it wasn't such a miracle that there was this industrialization process in the Soviet Union in the 30s. It was just that all the production technology already existed, just not there, so it had to be brought in. And yeah, I guess we've then seen that again in the 80s and 90s in China. It's just that there it was driven by actual investment. Western companies, not just bringing in their know-how and being paid to do so by government, but actually investing and actually transferring their production technologies.
Či tu v druhom rade ešte vpravo ostaňme chvíľu, potom sa presunieme.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. My name is Josef. I will ask in English the question, or some note. Regarding your charts about the young generation, about how they are now in some favor to the socialistic ideas of socialism, I somehow understand it because it's somehow intuitively can we can understand it that young people here in Slovakia, in other countries, Western countries, they have a lot of stuff, a lot of things, and they somehow can come logically to that ideas of socialism. What is my point? What I don't understand is that I see in our society that our parents are coming back to those ideas, which they were actually fighting the whole lives, or their lives against the socialism, and now they are coming back. I don't understand this. How it's that happening, and probably if you have some experience from other countries, if it's also happening in other countries. And I'm really curious about my way when you will come in 20 years, and I will be also advocating the socialistic ideas, and I will be asking you those questions. So I'm curious about that, and I don't understand how they come to those process. Thank you very much.
Well, I mean, yeah, of course, there are in any Western society that there are lots of problems. I mean, criticizing socialism doesn't mean that you have to endorse the status quo in its exact form. What I would simply say is that the problems that young people are facing differ from country to country. In Southern Europe, for example, it would mostly be youth unemployment. In Britain, it would be high housing costs. In America, it's probably more a matter of affording health insurance, things like that. But the fact that these are all different problems in different places shows you that this isn't something which is inherent in the market economy. Because for each of these problems, you can also identify countries, capitalist countries, that don't have that problem. So Britain has the problem with high housing costs. There are parts of the world that don't have that. In large parts of America, in Texas, for example, where they have a very liberal housing market, housing is very cheap and it's very easy to afford it. In America, they have problems with affording health insurance. Healthcare is extremely costly. However, in much of Europe, even in relatively market-based systems, market-based healthcare systems like the Netherlands, they don't have that problem. So that shows you can organize housing markets in a market-based way that work, like in Texas, like in Tokyo. You can organize healthcare in market-based ways, like in the Netherlands. There are examples of countries that don't have youth unemployment. Spain and Greece have that problem massively, but Britain doesn't, Ireland doesn't. That's why so many young Southern Europeans are moving to Britain. The fact that there is so much variation across capitalist economies in outcomes, and that for each problem that may exist, you can also find a counterexample. You can always find some place that doesn't have that problem. That shows you that we're not dealing with systemic failures, as we do in the case of socialism, where it's not one or two or three, it's all of them. In the case of problems in market economies, it really is one or two or three, and then many counterexamples. And that shows you here we're not dealing with something systemic that you cannot solve in a market economy. You're dealing with problems caused by specific policies. You're dealing with something quite narrow, something that requires some fairly targeted policy change in a specific sector, rather than a wholesale system-level change, rather than saying let's overthrow the entire system and build something totally new from scratch. It's more the kind of thing where you would say let's change something here in this sector, let's change something there in that sector, let's do something quite like keyhole surgery, change things in specific places, rather than let's have a clean sweep and start everything all over again. That's the approach that I would generally recommend. Just whatever your policy area is that you're worried about, whether that's housing, whether it's healthcare, tuition fees, university costs, look around for some positive examples and learn from best practice. That doesn't sound very exciting, but there's normally a good or an okay example for almost everything. Now, secondly, why is it coming back among the older generation as well? I guess that's a very different phenomenon. Here, I can't talk about Slovakia, but I lived in East Berlin for six years, where I would imagine it would be a similar story to here, a similar history, similar preconditions there. And there you have these two socialisms side by side. You have the socialism of the young people, they would actively distance themselves from the GDR. They want nothing to do with the GDR. And you have the nostalgia of older people. And they may sound similar, but they really talk about completely different things. The older ones would mention the GDR maybe in a positive way. The younger ones would want nothing to do with that. Well, what's happening there is that on the one hand, yes, in the abstract you get fairly large numbers of people above a certain age saying some things were better in the old GDR, but it's not necessarily the socialist aspects that they embrace. If you ask them, what exactly is it that you miss about it? They would often say things like, well, the school system was better, or there was less crime, policing was tougher. That's not a socialist argument. You could in principle have a Western society with very tough policing, not necessarily something that I would want, police that overrides civil liberties, but something that isn't, that you could in principle have in a Western society. It's just what happened in these places is that you had a lot of social changes occurring suddenly in the 90s that are not directly related to the economic system. One thing that I guess a lot of older people in East Germany will complain about is immigration. In the GDR they had basically no immigration. They had a few people from poorer socialist societies, they had Vietnamese people, maybe a few thousand Cubans, but that was it. You could, I guess, grow up in East Germany and never see a non-white person. And then suddenly you have a much more pluralistic society, a lot of people like that, I think this makes us more interesting. Some people don't like it, as always with these social changes. And when you ask them, do you miss the old GDR, a lot of people may be describing very different things. You may have someone who says, yes, the GDR was better, and you think, that person must be a socialist. Maybe they just don't like immigrants. Maybe it's something more mundane. Maybe they're talking about things like that. Or maybe they just miss, I don't know, the music of their youth.
Nech sa páči, v treťom rade vľavo, idem ho ruku.
Dobrý deň, Jozef Legend, položím po slovenský otázku. Chcem len povedať takto, že ja mám štátnicu z marxizmu, leninizmu, aj keď som inžinier a mám aj psychologické vzdelanie, takže to je vlastne, preto na základe toho kladiem túto otázku. Keď som v 93. prvýkrát navštívil Francúzsko a bol som tam dlhšie, tak som skonštatoval, a to som povedal aj mojim francúzským kolegom, že my sme sa síce socializmus pokúšali vybudovať, ale im sa to podarilo. Takže chcem sa spýtať, že prečo ste medzi tie príklady akože skrachovaného socializmu nezaradili aj Francúzsko, čo je veľmi aktuálny príklad. A druhá otázka je, že v podstate, či ste sa nezamysleli nad tým, že tá príťažlivosť socializmu, či nie je daná tým, čo dneska vyvádza ten kapitalizmus zo sociologického hľadiska. Ďakujem.
Okay, so you passed an actual test in Marxism-Leninism. That's a skill which might become valuable again with socialism on the rise again. So, yeah, keep those old tests. You might need it again. Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't. France is a very heavily state-dominated economy. There's no two ways about that. It's probably the closest you can go within what still broadly qualifies as a market economy, but it is absolutely at the statist end of that. If you went a bit further from there, you would probably end up in actual socialism. I haven't included them because there was, as far as I know, never a time when intellectuals elsewhere said we want to be like France. So that was never really a thing. Well, it is in the cultural sphere, of course, there's a lot of admiration for French movies and whatever, for French high culture. but millennial socialists in Britain and America today, or their counterparts in earlier generations, would not have said, let's be like France. But the relative success of France, yeah, I have to admit, is a mystery to me. It's if you go by the economics textbook, this shouldn't happen. They should be in a far worse state than they actually are. They seem to be ignoring almost every lesson from basic introductory economics and somehow get away with it. But of course, they have their issues with youth unemployment in particular, and the pension system that just cannot go on. That they still retire in their early 60s and having, sometimes much earlier, and having one of the highest life expectancies in the world. So at some point something will have to change there. But yeah, so far they seem to be getting away with an insane amount of state interventionism and economic planning. I guess this is really just a guess, no empirical evidence here. I guess one thing that they do better than Britain is that in France it would be easier to just physically build stuff. That infrastructure projects are, I think, completed much quicker in France than they would be in Britain, and housing development as well. And maybe that is a result of their very centralized system, that maybe they don't have to deal with local objections. If they want to build a motorway across the country, they just do it. If they want to build a new power plant or whatever, they just do it. Whereas in a place like Britain, you would have massive resistance. And I read somewhere that the Eurostar, for example, which was the tunnel which was a joint British-French project, that the French side was much quicker doing that. They were already halfway through the channel, while in Britain they were still arguing with how to appease local neighborhood groups who were opposing this, who were saying we don't want this in our neighborhood, build it somewhere else, and this goes on for years. And France just says, okay, the motorway goes here, the tunnel goes there, and that's it. Not a system I necessarily recommend, but in those areas it seems to work. Maybe that's one reason why the French economy is not as bad as it should be.
Posledná otázka, last question, tu za stĺpom som videl ruku. Last question.
Good evening, my name is Pavel Angel. I would like to ask a question in English, apparently. I wanted to ask about the amount of professors and, let's say, intellectuals on the universities. I've seen one study that more than half of them, more than 50%, are actually claiming that they are Marxists. Where do you, especially on the liberal arts, where this percentage is even higher? I want to ask, what is the reason? Is it some kind of intellectual laziness that they can't imagine things that they something don't know, like in the market economy, they don't know the results, what will happen, etc. Or is it some kind of the socialism creates some castes of planners, and they will have their work for a whole life, and they will be, let's say, the rulers? Or is something like a less sinister idea? Thank you.
Yeah, that's something I don't know a huge amount about, but there's some work on that by Jonathan Haidt, the American, what is he technically, an evolutionary psychologist. He looks at this, the polarization of campus culture and how the humanities in particular are moving further and further leftwards. He says that this wasn't always that way. There's always been a preponderance, that there have always been left majorities, but a generation ago it wasn't overwhelming. You would have 2/3 also in a sociology department would be on the left, but you would still have a few conservatives, liberals, it would always be a minority, but it would still be a respectable minority, whereas now in some departments it's moved more towards close to 100%. And I guess there is just an element of self-censorship going on, and a lot of ostracism. We see this all the time, that somebody speaks out, somebody says something that would be in a left-wing environment would be considered unacceptable, controversial, and then you get a massive controversy around it, witch hunts, somebody might get fired, or you have big demonstrations of students disrupting lectures, and yeah, I guess you just don't, if you're in that environment, you just don't want to be that guy, you don't want to be the target, so you just go along with mainstream opinion, and so it's just a basic conformism. And I think what often happens with conformism is that you may adopt a belief initially because the social costs are low. You may initially just say what you think you're expected to say, but over time it can become a real conviction. So to say that somebody is conformist doesn't necessarily mean that they secretly believe something else. It doesn't mean that maybe a third of them are secretly conservatives and just don't want to say it, but it does mean that they maybe don't have strong views initially, go along vaguely with the left-wing orthodoxy, that after a couple of years that just becomes their actual persuasion, and that then becomes a real conviction, and that's how these environments become more and more homogenous. You have group pressure and group think. Nobody wants to be the socially ostracized one. And there's also the argument made by Thomas Sowell, the American conservative, who says that academia and the world of public intellectuals in particular is just a world where there is no cost to being wrong. So if you're wrong all the time, it doesn't matter. A lot of these people that I showed you today are still big figures today. You can Noam Chomsky, of course, the prime example, was always on the wrong side, idolizing the Venezuelan government, recently engaged in Cambodian genocide denial in the 70s, consistently wrong. It doesn't do his reputation any harm. Whereas in any other area, if you're so wrong so many times, well, you would suffer in some way. If you're an investor and you always put all your money in companies that go bust 2 days afterwards, then you go bankrupt pretty quickly. If you're an employee and you have to handle projects that fail all the time, you will get fired. Yeah, there is just no other environment in which you have no feedback mechanism where you can be wrong all the time and still be admired. And it's just a safe space where being wrong doesn't come at any costs, where what determines your success is not whether you're wrong or right, it's whether you get the approval of your peers. I know that doesn't really answer your question, because that just raises the question, why are all the others also so wrong? But once you have that situation in place, I can't explain where it comes from initially, but I don't find it too baffling that once you have it, it stays that way.
Tak aj dnes sa ukazuje, že o socializme by sme mohli diskutovať veľmi dlho. Aj tých mýtov o socializme je veľa a naozaj aj memento socializmu je stále živé. Ja vám chcem dať len do pozornosti, že aj Konzervatívny inštitút finišuje na jednej takej publikácii a v priebehu mesiaca 2 vydáme publikáciu, kde budeme vyvracať faktami a realitou tie mýty, ktoré kolujú medzi ľuďmi o socializme. Takže potom môžeme opäť diskutovať aj na konkrétnejších príkladoch Slovenska, Československa, ako to reálne bolo a čo to znamenalo. Ale teraz už naozaj ten čas je vzácny a ja by som postupne ukončil dnešnú diskusiu, dnešnú prednášku. Ešte raz by som chcel poďakovať partnerom, ktorí nám pomohli ju zorganizovať. Ďakujem vám, že ste prišli. Pevne verím, že opäť o štvrťroka sa stretneme na podobnej prednáške na inú tému a preto všetkým chcem poďakovať pánovi doktorovi Niemietzovi za jeho prednášku a za odpovede na vaše otázky. Ďakujem.